Welcome to Thousand Year Mystery. We are your guides into the footsteps of history, peeling back the layers of time to confront the enigmas sealed within. Today, we begin a new journey, a 15-part exploration of the most terrifying and persistent legend in the annals of archaeology. We speak, of course, of the Curse of King Tut, a story defined by one chilling proclamation: everyone who entered the tomb would meet the same fate. We begin in a place of endings, a desolate valley of baked limestone and suffocating silence west of the Nile, across from the vibrant city of Thebes. This is not a place for the living. It is a necropolis, a city of the dead. It is the Valley of the Kings. For centuries, the great pharaohs of Egypt's new kingdom had sought eternity here. They abandoned the monumental pyramids of their ancestors, structures that served as little more than giant flashing signposts for tomb robbers. Instead, they sought security in secrecy, cutting their eternal homes deep into the bedrock, hiding the entrances and sealing them with the authority of the gods. But the gods, it seems, were poor guardians. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Valley of the Kings was considered an exhausted resource. It had been systematically plundered for 3,000 years, first by ancient thieves, then by Roman treasure hunters, and finally by the great competitive wave of 19th century Egyptologists. Men like Belzoni, the circus strongman turned antiquarian, had used brute force and dynamite to tear secrets from the rock. Every known royal tomb, from the great Ramesses to Thutmose, had been found, and every single one was empty, their mummies desecrated, their treasures long gone. The consensus among the world's experts was simple: there was nothing left to find. But one man refused to believe it. His name was Howard Carter. Carter was not like the other Egyptologists of his day. He was not a wealthy aristocrat or a university-educated scholar. He was the son of an artist, a man of humble birth who had come to Egypt as a teenager with a delicate hand and a keen eye, tasked with copying the paintings on tomb walls. He was precise, stubborn, and abrasive. He possessed none of the social graces of his peers, but he possessed something far more valuable: an unshakable, obsessive conviction. For years, Carter had been piecing together scattered clues: a small faience cup bearing a name, a fragment of a wooden box, a piece of gold foil, all of them found not in a tomb, but in the debris outside other tombs. And all of them bore the same obscure royal cartouche: Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun, the boy king, a minor pharaoh who had ruled briefly and died young, overshadowed by the giants who came before and after him. He was a footnote in the history books, so insignificant that it was entirely possible, Carter reasoned, that his tomb had been missed by the ancient robbers and missed by the modern explorers. Carter believed Tutankhamun's final resting place was still out there, hidden beneath the sands, waiting. For 6 long, brutal seasons, Carter dug. He dug with a meticulousness that bordered on madness, He didn't just dig holes. He systematically cleared the valley floor, grid by grid, scraping away the rubble of millennia, right down to the bedrock. He found nothing. His excavations were funded by a man as different from Carter as one could be. George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. Lord Carnarvon was the quintessential British aristocrat, fabulously wealthy, a reckless gambler, and an early pioneer of the automobile, an obsession that nearly cost him his life. A devastating crash in Germany in 1903 left him physically frail. His doctors advised he spend his winters in a warmer, drier climate to protect his damaged lungs. He chose Egypt. Bored by the polite society of Luxor, Carnarvon decided to take up archaeology as a hobby, something to pass the time. He needed a professional to lead the actual digging, and he was introduced to the intense, solitary Howard Carter. A strange partnership was forged. The impatient, high-stakes gambler and the meticulous, patient archaeologist. For year after year, Carnarvon's money funded Carter's failure. The Egyptian desert is a cruel master. It offers only heat, dust, and crushing disappointment. The teams of workers toiled under the blistering sun, moving thousands of tons of rock and sand, only to find more rock and sand. The morale of the team was shattered. The scientific community began to openly mock Carter's folly. By 1921, Lord Carnarvon was done. He had spent a fortune, the equivalent of millions today, chasing Carter's ghost. He summoned Carter to Highclere Castle, his estate in England, for one final, difficult meeting. The 1922 season, Carnarvon informed him, would be the last. The funding was being cut. It was over. Carter, faced with the death of his life's work, became desperate. He pleaded, he argued, he pointed to one last, small, triangular patch of ground on his map of the valley. It was an area near the base of the tomb of Ramesses VI, a spot they had overlooked because it was covered by the ruins of ancient workmen's huts. It seemed an unlikely place, almost too obvious. Carter made an extraordinary offer. He told Carnarvon that if the Earl would fund just one more season, Carter would pay for it himself if nothing was found. Carnarvon, perhaps moved by Carter's desperation, or perhaps struck by one last gambler's hunch, relented. One final season. One last roll of the dice. On November 1st, 1922, Carter returned to Luxor. His mood was bleak. This was not a hopeful expedition. It was the execution of a final duty. He directed his foreman to the small triangle of land he had marked. The workers, many of whom had been with Carter for years, began their work with a familiar, weary rhythm. They began to clear the ancient huts, stone by stone. 3 days passed. Nothing. On the morning of November 4th, 1922, Carter was not even at the site. He was delayed at his house when a messenger arrived, breathless, bearing an urgent note from his foreman. Carter raced to the dig site. The usual noise of excavation had stopped. The workers were gathered in a silent, excited circle. There, emerging from the debris where a hut had stood just hours before, was a single, flat stone. It was the top of a step cut directly into the bedrock, leading down into the darkness. It was a staircase. The air in the valley was electric. The air in the valley was electric. The discovery of a single step had shattered the monotony of years. Howard Carter, a man known for his rigid composure, was now frantic with a hope he dared not fully embrace. He ordered his men to work with feverish haste, but also with agonizing care. This was not a treasure hunt, it was a resurrection. The single step became 2, then 3. A staircase choked with rubble descended into the earth. As they cleared the debris, the oppressive heat of the valley seemed to concentrate in this growing wound in the ground. The workers, coated in white dusk, passed baskets of stone and sand from hand to hand, a human chain stretching back into the light. After days of relentless, careful digging, they reached the bottom. 12 steps down, they were confronted not by an opening, but by a wall. A doorway. It was plastered over with smooth gray cement, a shade not seen by human eyes in over 3,000 years. And pressed into that plaster, repeated over and over, were the impressions of ancient seals. Carter's heart pounded. He examined the seals closely. He recognized the image. The jackal god Anubis crouched atop 9 bound captives. This was the royal seal of the necropolis, the mark of the guardians of the dead. The tomb was official. It was royal. But as Carter's eyes scanned the plaster, his hope was tempered by a cold dread. In the upper left-hand corner, the plaster was different. It was rougher, darker. The seals there were broken. Someone had been here before. Tomb robbers. Carter was overcome with a familiar sickness. Was this just another empty shell? Had he found nothing but the scene of an ancient crime? He continued to examine the doorway. The evidence told a story. There were 2 distinct sets of seals. The larger, clearer seals of Anubis, and smaller, more hurried seals of a different kind. Seals bearing the cartouche of Tutankhamun himself. The story became clear. Robbers had entered the tomb, likely shortly after the king was buried. But they had been caught. Priests of the necropolis had entered after them, repaired the damage as best they could, and resealed the doorway. This meant the tomb was not intact, but it also meant it was not entirely empty. The priests would not have bothered to reseal a tomb that had been completely plundered. Something was still inside. Carter faced a terrible dilemma. He was the archaeologist. He had the right to open that door. But the tomb's concession, the legal right to excavate, belonged to his patron, Lord Carnarvon, who was thousands of miles away in England. To open it without him was unthinkable. With an act of almost superhuman restraint, Carter made a decision. He ordered his men to backfill the entire staircase. He buried it all. He covered the entrance, hiding it from the world once more, and posted armed guards around the clock. He then rode to the nearest telegraph office and sent what would become one of the most famous cables in history. It was addressed to Lord Carnarvon. at last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations. The wait was agonizing. It would take Carnarvon over 2 weeks to travel from Highclere Castle by ship and by train to Egypt. During those 2 weeks, Carter lived in a state of suspended animation. He patrolled the site, his mind racing. What was behind the door? Was it a single small chamber? A vast complex? Was it filled with the scraps the robbers had left behind? Or was it, by some miracle, substantially untouched? The news, despite Carter's attempts at secrecy, began to leak. The other archaeologists in the valley, the very ones who had dismissed Carter's obsession, were now buzzing with rumor and professional jealousy. The air in Luxor grew thick with anticipation. On November 23rd, Lord Carnarvon finally arrived, bringing with him his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, who was just as keen an Egyptophile as her father. Carter met them, his face a mask of nervous energy. The time for waiting was over. The next morning, November 24th, 1922, the team assembled at the base of the excavated staircase. Carter, Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn, and Arthur Callender, Carter's trusted engineer. They stood before the sealed doorway. The silence of the valley was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. Carter, with Carnarvon at his side, began to meticulously record the seals, photographing them, drawing them, before finally, carefully, beginning to dismantle the 3,000-year-old barrier. Stone by stone, the plaster and rubble were removed. Beyond the doorway, a corridor was revealed. It sloped downward, dark and ominous, and it was filled, just as Carter had feared, with limestone chippings and debris. This was the path of the ancient robbers. For another full day, they cleared the corridor. It was back-breaking work in the cramped, airless space. The corridor was only about 6 feet high. They found broken pottery, fragments of wooden boxes, scraps of linen, the discarded leftovers of a hurried theft. The sense of disappointment was palpable. It seemed they were, once again, too late. Then, at the end of the long passage, they hit another wall. A second sealed doorway. It was identical to the first, plastered and stamped with the same 2 sets of seals, the seals of Anubis and the seals of Tutankhamun. And just like the first door, it bore the telltale marks of a breach and a resealing. The robbers had been here too. They had passed through this door, but they had also been sealed out of this door. This was the true entrance to the tomb. Whatever lay beyond, the robbers had been there, but the priests had followed, and they had sealed it for a second time. On the afternoon of November 26th, the small group stood before this final barrier. The air was thick with ancient dust and the smell of stale, trapped time. Carter, his hands shaking slightly, took a small chisel, a testing rod, and hammered it into the upper left corner of the doorway, near the ancient breach. He created a small, dark hole. First, he struck a match and held it to the opening, testing for foul gases. The flame did not extinguish. Instead, it flickered, dancing wildly as hot air, trapped for millennia, escaped from the chamber within, smelling faintly of perfume, resin, and something else, something metallic and old. Carter widened the hole. He lit a candle and pushed it through the darkness. Lord Carnarvon, unable to bear the suspense, whispered, "Can you see anything?" Carter, holding the candle aloft, pressed his face to the opening. His eyes struggled to adjust. At first, he saw nothing but blackness. Then, as his pupils dilated, shapes began to emerge from the gloom. Strange shadows, bizarre forms, and the glint, everywhere, the glint of gold. He was struck dumb. He couldn't speak. Carnarvon, frantic, asked again, "Can you see anything?" Carter turned slowly, his face pale with an emotion that was part terror and part ecstasy. He moistened his lips and managed to speak the words that would echo through history. Yes, wonderful things. Wonderful things. The understatement of the century. What Howard Carter saw in the flickering candlelight was not a tomb chamber. It was chaos. It was a royal storage room, a divine attic, packed floor to ceiling with the entire treasury of a god king. He, Carnarvon, and Lady Evelyn widened the hole, making it just large enough to squeeze through. One by one, they stepped down into the darkness, their modern feet touching a floor last trod by priests in the Bronze Age. The room, which they would later call the Antechamber, was overwhelming. It was not the neat, orderly resting place they had imagined. It looked as though the owners had just moved out, or perhaps as if thieves had ransacked it in a panic. Everywhere they looked, gold glittered. Piled against one wall were the components of 3 massive gilded ceremonial couches, carved into the forms of bizarre hybrid animals: a lion, a cow, and a terrifying beast with the head of a hippopotamus and the body of a leopard. Stacked in a confused heap were the disassembled parts of several royal chariots, gleaming with gold inlay and precious stones, their wheels and axles tossed aside. Strange, black, life-size statues of the king stood guard, their skin coated in bitumen, their kilts and sandals of pure gold. There were alabaster vases of intricate design, chairs and thrones of breathtaking craftsmanship, caskets and boxes of all sizes, some spilling their contents, jewelry, fine linens, and royal robes. There were sentinel statues, carved wooden geese, and even bundles of dried flowers and seeds, offerings for the afterlife. It was the single greatest collection of treasure ever found, and this was just the first room. The evidence of the robbers was clear. Boxes had been riffled through, their lids torn off. Smaller items of gold and precious oils had been taken, but the larger, bulkier items, the couches, the chariots, the statues, were left behind. The thieves, it seemed, had been interrupted in their work. As their eyes adjusted, they saw what the thieves had been aiming for. On the far wall, flanked by the 2 black sentinel statues of the king, was another doorway. This one, too, was plastered and sealed. This was not the antechamber. This was not storage. This surely was the burial chamber. And if the antechamber, which the thieves had entered, was this full, what lay behind the sealed door they had not breached? The temptation to tear down that wall was almost unbearable. But Carter, the meticulous professional, took over. This was not a treasure hunt. This was archaeology. He knew that every item in the antechamber, from the largest couch to the smallest bead, had to be photographed, catalogued, stabilized, and removed before they could even think about touching that sealed door. It was a task that would take not days or weeks, but months, years even. They had found the tomb, but the work, the real painstaking scientific work, had only just begun. The world, however, was not patient. Carter and Carnarvon emerged from the tomb into the blinding Egyptian sun, their minds reeling. They tried to maintain secrecy, but it was impossible. The discovery was too big. Within days, the news exploded across the globe. Pharaoh's tomb found intact. Valley of Kings yields richest treasure. Sensational discovery in Egypt. The world went mad for King Tut. Luxor, a sleepy winter resort, was transformed overnight. Journalists, politicians, aristocrats, and tourists from every corner of the world descended upon the small town, all clamoring for information, all demanding to see the tomb. The Valley of the Kings, once a place of silence, became a circus. Carter, a man who loathed public attention, was besieged. He was hounded for interviews, for photographs, for private tours. The pressure was immense. To protect the excavation and regain control, he and Carnarvon made a fateful decision. They sold the exclusive rights to the story of the excavation to the Times of London for a massive sum. It was a practical decision, but it was a public relations disaster. The rest of the world's press, particularly the Egyptian newspapers, were furious. They had been shut out. Denied access, they were left to stand outside the tomb's entrance, frustrated, humiliated, and hungry for any scrap of a story. And if they couldn't get the real story, they would invent one. A narrative began to form, born of journalistic spite and ancient superstition. Whispers began to circulate among the digging crews, stories about the spirit of the Pharaoh being disturbed. The legend needed a spark. It found one in a tiny feathered creature. Howard Carter, a man of few comforts, kept a pet canary in his house in Luxor. It was a bright yellow bird, a small spot of life in the dusty brown landscape. His workers called it the golden bird and saw it as a good luck charm. The story, perhaps apocryphal, goes like this. On the very day the tomb was officially opened, Carter returned to his house to find a commotion. His servants were terrified. A cobra, the sacred serpent of the pharaohs, the symbol of royal power that adorned the king's death mask, had slithered into the house, entered the canary's cage, and eaten the bird. A cobra in the middle of Luxor in winter. The local workers were terrified. This was not an accident. This was a warning. The serpent of the Pharaoh had struck down the golden bird as punishment for violating the king's eternal rest. The press, waiting hungrily at the gates, seized upon the story. It was the perfect angle. The public, already captivated by the gold, was now captivated by the growing sense of dread. In London, the popular novelist Marie Corelli published an inflammatory letter. She quoted an ancient text that warned of dire punishment for any who entered a sealed tomb. "I dare to predict," she wrote, "that Lord Carnarvon will not live to see the tomb fully explored." The stage was set. The atmosphere was charged with foreboding. The tomb, once a scientific marvel, was now being recast as a place of danger. They were no longer excavators, they were intruders. And the curse, whether real or imagined, was waiting for its first victim. The victim would be the man who paid for it all, Lord Carnarvon. In early 1923, just a few months after the Wonderful Things speech, the excavation was proceeding, though slowly and under immense pressure. The antechamber was still being cleared. Carnarvon, having returned to England for a short time, was back in Luxor, but he was not a well man. The strain of the discovery, the relentless press, and the political battles with the Egyptian government over ownership of the artifacts were wearing him down. One evening, in his room at the Winter Palace Hotel in Luxor, Carnarvon was bitten on the cheek by a mosquito. It was a trivial event, a daily annoyance in Egypt. A few days later, while shaving, he accidentally sliced the top off the infected bite with his razor. It was a small cut, but it would prove fatal. The wound, exposed and aggravated, became infected. In the pre-antibiotic era, even a small infection could be a death sentence. Carnarvon developed a high fever. He grew weak, delirious. The infection spread, leading to erysipelas, a severe bacterial skin infection, and then to blood poisoning, sepsis. Doctors were summoned from Cairo, but they could do nothing. The 5th Earl of Carnarvon, the man whose gamble had funded the greatest discovery in history, was dying. He was moved to the Continental Savoy Hotel in Cairo, his condition worsening by the hour. The press, the same press he had angered, now waited in a grim vigil outside the hotel. The story of the canary and the cobra was retold with new, ominous significance. Lady Evelyn, his daughter, sat by his bedside, watching her father slip away. He thrashed in his fever, muttering deliriously. According to the nurses, he was heard to say, "I have heard the call. I am preparing." In the early morning hours of April 5th, 1923, the end came. At 1:55 a.m., Lord Carnarvon, his body ravaged by the infection, died. At that exact moment, according to the reports that would soon electrify the world, two strange things happened. In Cairo, as Carnarvon took his last breath, the entire city was suddenly plunged into darkness. A massive, inexplicable power failure struck the capital. The lights in the hotel, in the streets, across the city, all went out, leaving the deathbed scene in pitch blackness. And thousands of miles away, back at Highclere Castle in England, Carnarvon's beloved fox terrier, Susie, who had been sleeping peacefully, suddenly sat up, let out a long, terrible howl, and dropped dead. The coincidence was too perfect, too chilling to ignore. Lord Carnarvon was dead. The financier of the expedition, the first of the intruders, had fallen. Marie Corelli's prediction had come true. The whispers of a curse erupted into a global roar. This was not science. This was supernatural vengeance. The Pharaoh had claimed his first victim. The world was terrified and utterly fascinated. The story was no longer about gold and history. It was about life, death, and an ancient, implacable magic. But this was only the beginning. The curse, having tasted blood, was just getting started. One by one, those who had touched the tomb, who had visited it, who had even written about it, began to meet their own strange and untimely ends. The death of Lord Carnarvon unleashed a tidal wave of panic and superstition. The public, whipped into a frenzy by the press, began to see the hand of the Pharaoh in every subsequent misfortune. The curse was no longer a theory. It was an active, malevolent force. The list of victims began to grow. Shortly after Carnarvon's death, George J. Gould I, a wealthy American railroad financier and a friend of the Earl, visited the tomb. He had been given a private tour by Carter. Almost immediately upon leaving the valley, Gould fell ill with a high fever. He was rushed to the French Riviera, but his condition deteriorated. He died of pneumonia on May 16, 1923, just weeks after his visit. The press declared him the curse's second victim. Next came Prince Ali Kamel Fahmi Bey, an Egyptian aristocrat. He too visited the tomb, fascinated by the discovery that was putting his country on the world map. Just a few months later, in London, the prince was shot and killed by his own wife, Marie Marguerite, in a fit of jealous rage at the Savoy Hotel. A sordid domestic crime? Or was the Pharaoh's influence at play, driving the woman to madness? The newspapers heavily favored the latter. The curse, it seemed, was not limited to illness. It could manifest as violence. The men of science, those who sought to analyze and understand the tomb, were not spared. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, the British radiologist, was tasked with a groundbreaking job: to X-ray Tutankhamun's mummy before it was unwrapped. He performed his duty, handling the sacred remains, peering inside the king's very skull with his modern machine. A short time later, he began to complain of fatigue. A mysterious illness took hold, and within weeks, he was dead. The cause was never clearly identified. Arthur Weigall, another prominent Egyptologist, was present at the opening of the tomb. He was a contemporary and something of a rival to Howard Carter. He had been openly critical of Carter's exclusive deal with the Times. He was at the tomb constantly, observing, taking notes, and breathing the same air as the excavators. Weigall, too, fell ill with an undiagnosed fever. He wasted away and died in 1926. The curse was becoming a contagion. The core excavation team, the men closest to Carter, seemed to be marked. A.C. Mace, a vital member of the team from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, worked side by side with Carter during the grueling conservation of the antechamber's contents. He complained of exhaustion and pleurisy. His health collapsed, and he died in 1928, long before the excavation was complete. Richard Bethel, Howard Carter's personal secretary, was the man who helped catalog the Golden Hoard. He was young, healthy, and intimately involved with every artifact that came out of the tomb. In 1929, Bethel was found dead in his bed at an exclusive London club. The death was ruled a suicide, but rumors immediately spread that he had been smothered, his face bearing an expression of pure terror. The tragedy compounded. Bethel's father, Lord Westbury, was devastated by his son's death. Lord Westbury's home contained several artifacts that his son had, perhaps unwisely, brought back from Egypt. A few months after his son's death, Lord Westbury, in a fit of despair, threw himself from the 7th-story window of his apartment. His suicide note reportedly read, "I really cannot stand any more horrors." The press had a field day. The curse had claimed a son, and then, in its cruel persistence, it had claimed the father. Even objects associated with the tomb were considered lethal. The funeral hearse carrying Lord Westbury's body to the cemetery reportedly struck and killed a small child playing in the street. The body count was rising. Fever, suicide, murder, accidents. The methods were varied, but the origin, in the public's mind, was singular. It all led back to the small, dark hole in the Valley of the Kings. It all led back to Tutankhamun. The tomb was now open. The great sarcophagus was revealed. The golden shrines were being dismantled one by one to reveal the king's coffin. But as the list of the dead grew longer, a strange and unsettling question began to emerge. All these people, visitors, financiers, scientists, and secretaries, were dying. But the one man who should have been first, the man who breached the seals, the man who breathed the trapped air first, the man who spent more time in the tomb than anyone else, Howard Carter, remained perfectly healthy. He continued his work, seemingly untouched by the supernatural plague that was felling everyone around him. The curse, it seemed, was isolating him. It was taking his friends, his colleagues, and his supporters, leaving him alone with his discovery. The world watched and waited. The Pharaoh was patient. Perhaps he was simply saving the worst fate for the man who had led the desecration. The world was watching Howard Carter. They saw a man untouched by the supernatural, a man who walked into the Pharaoh's sacred space day after day and emerged coated in dust, but very much alive. Was he protected? Had he made some dark pact? Or was the curse simply biding its time, crafting a punishment far more subtle and cruel than a quick, feverish death? The truth was that Howard Carter was cursed, but it was not a curse born of ancient magic, of cobras, or of vengeful spirits. It was a curse of bureaucracy, of politics, and of an almost unbearable, crushing weight of responsibility. While the newspapers of the world were busy counting bodies and inventing ghost stories, Carter was fighting a war, a very modern, very bitter war. His enemy was not a mummy, it was the Egyptian government. The political climate in 1923 was a powder keg. Egypt, after decades of British occupation, was boiling with a new, fierce nationalism. The cry for "Egypt for the Egyptians" was on every street corner. And into this fire, Carter and Carnarvon had thrown the ultimate symbol of Egyptian heritage, the untouched tomb of a pharaoh. The original agreement, the concession signed by Carnarvon, was a relic of a colonial era. It granted the excavator a significant share of the findings. But the new Egyptian government, led by the nationalist Waft Party, saw this differently. This was not treasure to be divided up like pirate booty. This was the sacred patrimony of the Egyptian people, and they were not going to let another foreign power walk away with it. The man Carter had to face was Pierre Lecoq, a Frenchman, and the new Director General of the Antiquities Service. Lecoq was a formidable scholar, but he was also a politician, and he was determined that every single object from Tutankhamun's tomb would remain in Egypt, in the Cairo Museum. The battle began almost immediately. Carter, the stubborn, abrasive individualist, saw this as an attack on his professional rights. He was the discoverer. The tomb was his. The government saw him as an arrogant colonial relic. The press, already angered by Carter's exclusive deal with the Times of London, sided firmly with the Egyptians. They painted Carter as a greedy Englishman, a modern-day tomb robber in a pith helmet, trying to steal Egypt's past. The curse of the Pharaoh was, in reality, the curse of paperwork. Every day, Carter's work was interrupted by new regulations, new inspections, new demands. He was forced to allow official tours for politicians and dignitaries who tramped through his fragile excavation site, demanding explanations, while his real work lay suspended. The government insisted that the tomb be open to the press. Carter refused, citing the fragility of the artifacts. The government saw it as an act of defiance. The conflict reached its peak over the sarcophagus. Carter, after months of painstakingly clearing the antechamber, had finally breached the sealed doorway to the burial chamber. He had found the massive golden shrines nested one inside the other. He was on the precipice of the final revelation. At that exact moment, the government made its move. They revoked the concession. They seized the tomb. They locked Howard Carter out. They placed a new, heavy iron gate at the entrance to the tomb, and they posted their own guards. Carter, the man who had found it, was forbidden from entering. This was a humiliation beyond measure. Carter was incandescent with rage. He felt betrayed by his own country, which offered little diplomatic support, and hunted by the Egyptians. He shut down the entire operation. He fired his workers, left Luxor in protest, and embarked on a lecture tour of the United States. For an entire year, the tomb of Tutankhamun, the greatest discovery on Earth, lay in darkness, a hostage in a political stalemate. The delicate, priceless artifacts, some of which had begun to degrade upon contact with the modern air, were left to wait. This was the true curse, the agonizing, infuriating paralysis. Carter, the man of action, the meticulous excavator, was reduced to writing furious letters and giving angry interviews from thousands of miles away. He was isolated, just as the curse-mongers had predicted. But he was isolated by his own stubbornness and by a political machine he could not defeat. The public, of course, saw this differently. The Pharaoh, they whispered, had protected his inner sanctum. He had used the mortal's own greed and politics to halt the desecration, locking the intruders out. During this time, the deaths continued. The list grew longer, and every death was another nail in Carter's public coffin, painting him as the reckless puppet master whose obsession was leading everyone else to their doom. He was alone. His patron, Carnarvon, was dead. His colleagues, Mace and Bethel, were ailing or dead. His professional reputation was being shredded. Finally, after a change in the Egyptian government, a compromise was reached. The terms were a total surrender for Carter. He could return to work, but as a salaried employee of the Antiquities Service. He would have no share of the treasure. He would have no exclusive rights. Every single item would go to the Cairo Museum. Carter, defeated and bitter, but desperate to finish what he started, agreed. He returned to the valley in 1925, a changed man. The joy of discovery was gone, replaced by a grim, joyless duty. He was no longer the triumphant explorer. He was the hired help, working under the constant, suspicious watch of Egyptian inspectors. He returned to the tomb, the iron gate clanging shut behind him, and resumed his work in the suffocating silence. He had won the right to finish, but he had lost everything else. He was a prisoner of his own discovery. The curse was working perfectly. It had not touched his body, but it had begun to systematically destroy his life, his spirit, and his legacy. And he still had not faced the king. The work that resumed in 1925 was the most delicate, complex, and scientifically groundbreaking excavation ever attempted. It was also a logistical nightmare. The world, obsessed with the curse, saw only the gold and the glamour. They did not see the reality. The reality was 110-degree heat, choking dust, and the agonizing, nerve-shredding fragility of time itself. The Antechamber, which Carter and his team had spent over 2 years clearing, was just the beginning. The artifacts were not simply found, they were rescued. Imagine lifting a royal robe woven with threads of gold that has not been touched for 33 centuries. It looks perfect, but the moment you touch it, the ancient linen, its fibers weakened by millennia, disintegrates into a cloud of brown dust, leaving only the gold thread behind. This was the challenge Carter faced every single day. He and his small, dedicated team, led by the chemist Alfred Lucas and the artist Harry Burton, created a conservation laboratory out of nothing. They converted an empty nearby tomb, number 15, into a makeshift headquarters. This lab was the real magic of the Tutankhamun discovery. Every item, no matter how small, was treated like a critically ill patient. First, it was photographed in situ by Burton, his large format camera capturing the ghostly, chaotic scenes in stunning black and white. Then, its position was meticulously recorded on grid maps. Only then would the item be touched. A gilded wooden chair, its joints now just dried out wood and brittle glue, would be sprayed with a fine mist of celluloid solution to bind its structure. Or it might be wrapped in bandages, like a mummy itself, just to survive the 100-yard journey to the lab. Once in the lab, the real work began. Alfred Lucas, the chemist, would analyze the materials. He boiled water on Bunsen burners to create steam for humidifying and softening warped wooden boxes. He painstakingly cleaned encrusted jewelry with solvents. This was the real wonderful things, not the gold, but the preservation. They saved things that should have turned to dust. They saved the king's childhood toys, his feathered fans, his sandals, and even the dried, blackened remnants of the food left for his final journey. While this meticulous work continued, Carter turned his attention to the burial chamber. The room itself was small, but it was almost entirely filled by a single monolithic object. A massive, box-like shrine. It was more than 16 feet long and 11 feet wide. Its wooden walls covered in thick sheets of gold and inlaid with panels of brilliant blue faience, the color of the divine. It was so large there was barely 2 feet of clearance between the shrine and the painted walls of the chamber. Carter and his men had to work in suffocatingly cramped conditions, their bodies pressed against the ancient plaster. The doors of the shrine were bolted, but not locked. The rope securing the bolts was still tied and sealed with the jackal and captive seal of the necropolis. The seal was unbroken. This was it. The antechamber had been breached. The corridor had been breached. But this, the final sanctuary, was untouched. The robbers had not passed this point. With a trembling hand, Carter cut the ancient rope. He pulled back the bolts. He and his team eased open the tall, golden doors. Inside, there was not a coffin. There was another shrine. It was covered in a delicate, dark linen pall, which was spangled with hundreds of small, gilded bronze rosettes, like a starry night sky. When Carter touched the pall, it disintegrated in his hands. Beneath it, the second shrine gleamed. It, too, was covered in gold, its doors bolted and sealed. Carter opened the second shrine. Inside, there was a third shrine. It was a breathtaking puzzle box, a set of divine Russian nesting dolls. Each one was more intricately decorated than the last, covered in hieroglyphic spells from the Book of the Dead, designed to protect the king on his journey. Carter, working in the cramped, hot, airless space, opened the third shrine. And inside that, he found the fourth and final shrine. This one was the most magnificent. Its golden panels carved with images of winged goddesses, Isis, Nephthys, Selket, and Neith, their arms outstretched, enveloping the final mystery in a protective, eternal embrace. The tension was unbearable. The world waited. The press, still hungry for any news, published daily updates on the Shrine of Gold. Carter opened the doors of the fourth shrine, and there, filling the space within, was the sarcophagus. It was not a box. It was a masterpiece. It was carved from a single massive block of yellow quartzite. Its corners were protected by the same four goddesses, their faces serene, their arms carved in high relief, holding the king secure. The lid, made of red granite, was immense, weighing over 1.5 tons. This was the final barrier. Inside this stone box lay the king. The excavation, which had begun with a single step, had now reached its focal point. The antechamber, the treasury, the annex, all had been cleared. All their wonders had been catalogued. Now, all that remained was the king himself. Carter and his team rigged up a system of ropes and pulleys, a heavy-duty block and tackle to attach to the lid. The small chamber was crowded with men, their muscles straining, their faces streaming with sweat. Slowly, agonizingly, they began to raise the massive granite lid. It groaned in protest, the first sound it had made in 33 centuries. The lid rose, inch by inch. Carter, holding a lamp, peered into the gap. The darkness within was broken by a familiar, stunning glint. The sarcophagus was not empty. It was filled, almost to the brim, by a massive, shadowy form. It was shaped like a man, but it was a man made of solid gold. He had found the king's coffin. The sight that greeted Carter inside the sarcophagus was the single most breathtaking object in the entire tomb. It was not a coffin in the modern sense. It was a golden effigy of the king himself. It was 7 feet 4 inches long, carved from cypress wood and overlaid with thick, burnished gold. The king's face stared up at them, serene and divine. His arms were crossed over his chest in the traditional pose of Osiris, the god of the afterlife. In his hands, he grasped the crook and the flail, the symbols of royalty. His forehead was protected by the vulture and the cobra, the goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt. But what truly stunned them was the coffin's surface. It was not bare gold. It was covered from head to foot in a thick, black, lustrous residue. Ancient priests, in a final ritual, had anointed the entire coffin with massive quantities of sacred perfumes and resins. Over the millennia, these oils had solidified, cementing the golden coffin to the bottom of the sarcophagus. This black, sticky pitch was both a blessing and a curse. It had made the coffin impossible for the ancient robbers to steal, and it made it almost impossible for Carter's team to remove. They were forced to use solvents, heat, and immense physical force, working in the cramped sarcophagus to loosen the 3,000-year-old glue. It took days. Finally, they attached the lifting tackles to silver handles on the coffin's side, and, with a great groan, the massive first coffin was hoisted from its stone bed. It was only then, as they began to clean it in the outer chamber, that Carter discovered something astonishing. At the foot of the coffin, there were tiny separate silver handles. He pulled them. A set of pins released. The golden shell of the coffin was not one piece, it was a lid. He and his team lifted the golden lid. Inside was a second coffin. It too was a perfect mummiform effigy of the king. It was even more richly decorated, inlaid with thousands of tiny, multicolored pieces of glass and semi-precious stones, creating a feathered pattern, a divine falcon cloak of rissy work. This second coffin was also covered in the same black ritual resin, which had hardened like ebony, and it too was stuck fast to what lay beneath it. The process had to be repeated. More solvents, more careful heating, more agonizing, slow prying. Carter, by this point, was working on pure adrenaline. The pressure was immense. The entire world was waiting to see the king's face. They lifted the lid of the second coffin, and the world stopped. There was no third coffin. There was only pure, solid, burnished gold. This was the third and final coffin, the one that actually held the mummy. It was not gilded wood. It was 243 pounds, 100 kilograms of solid cast gold. Today, its bullion value alone would be over $7 million. As an artifact, it is, quite simply, priceless. It is the single most valuable object ever discovered. Carter was speechless. He was looking at the ultimate expression of royal power and belief in eternity. But this final golden effigy was also coated in the black resin, which had hardened like cement, gluing the king's body to the bottom of the golden shell. They had reached the king, and they were stuck. The mummy could not be removed. The resin was as hard as stone. Carter and his team, including Dr. Douglas Derry, the anatomist who would perform the autopsy, held a conference. They tried to soften the resin with heat, placing the golden coffin out in the 150-degree Egyptian sun. It had no effect. They were left with only one option, a brutal, terrible option. To get to the king, they would have to destroy the coffin's contents. Dr. Derry and his team began their work. It was not a respectful unwrapping. It was, by necessity, a brutal dismantling. They used hot knives to melt the resin, prying the mummy from its golden bed piece by piece. The ancient, fragile linen bandages, soaked in the resin, had carbonized. As they cut through the layers, they found an unbelievable treasure trove, buried on the mummy itself. 143 separate objects were tucked into the wrappings. Amulets of jade and lapis lazuli, golden rings, bejeweled collars, and, placed directly over the king's heart, a large sacred scarab beetle carved from a greenish stone. 2 golden ceremonial daggers were strapped to his thighs. One had a golden blade. The other had a blade of iron from the sky, a metal forged from a meteorite. They were, quite literally, dismembering a king. Finally, they reached the body itself, and on the king's face they found the last greatest treasure, the death mask. a perfect, serene, impossibly beautiful portrait of the young king, beaten from solid gold, inlaid with lapis lazuli and quartz. It had been placed directly on the mummy's head, separated by a thin layer of resin. When Carter lifted it, he was the first person in 3,340 years to look upon the true face of Tutankhamun. The body itself was that of a young man, almost a boy. But the autopsy process, the hot knives, the prying, and the hardened resin had done terrible damage. In the end, to remove the king from his golden prison, they had to cut the mummy in half at the torso. They broke the arms and legs. The scientific desecration, in many ways, was far more brutal than anything the ancient robbers could have imagined. The world finally had its king, but he had been torn apart to be revealed. This brutal scientific violation, many whispered, was the ultimate sin. This was the act that would seal the fate of all who were involved. The curse, which had been patient, now had its ultimate justification. The mummy had been defiled, and the man responsible was Howard Carter. The mummy had been unwrapped. The king's treasures were on their way to the Cairo Museum. The excavation was, for all intents and purposes, a scientific success. But the deaths continued, and with the brutal autopsy of the king fresh in the public's mind, the belief in the curse was stronger than ever. The public and the press had the narrative they wanted: a vengeful pharaoh, a string of mysterious deaths, and a supernatural plague. But as the hysteria began to cool, another group of people began to look at the curse with a different, more skeptical eye. Scientists, doctors, statisticians. They asked a simple question: was this really a curse, or was it something else? The search for a rational explanation for the Curse of King Tut began. The first and most compelling theory was the tomb toxin hypothesis. Think about it. A tomb sealed for over 3,300 years. Inside, there are organic materials, mummified remains, funeral flowers, offerings of food, wooden furniture, oils, and perfumes. All of this has been decomposing, however slowly, in a dark, stagnant, airless environment. What precisely was in the air that Carter, Carnarvon, and the others breathed in when they first breached the seals? Scientists proposed that the tomb could have been a perfect incubator for deadly ancient pathogens, bacteria, viruses, or, most likely, toxic mold spores. When the seals were broken, these dormant, microscopic killers were aerosolized, puffed into the air by the escaping drafts, and inhaled by the excavators. This theory gained enormous traction. It sounded scientific. It sounded plausible. They pointed to Lord Carnarvon, a mosquito bite sliced open in a hot, dusty climate. It was the perfect entry point for a deadly bacterium, perhaps a strain of streptococcus or staphylococcus, which could easily cause the sepsis that killed him. Was this bacterium normal, or was it a special, hyper-virulent strain that had been festering in the tomb? They looked at the other victims: George J. Gould, Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, A.C. Mace. What did they have in common? Respiratory failure, fevers, pneumonia-like symptoms. This pointed directly to mold. Specifically, molds like Aspergillus niger and Aspergillus flavus. These are common fungi, but in a sealed environment, their spores could have grown to an incredible toxic concentration. When inhaled, especially by someone with a weakened immune system, like Lord Carnarvon with his damaged lungs, these spores could cause a severe, often fatal allergic reaction, or a lung infection called aspergillosis. In 1998, researchers took samples from the walls of similar nearby tombs. They found viable spores of Aspergillus and other fungi, proving that these microbes can survive for millennia. The curse, they argued, was biological warfare. The ancient priests, perhaps not even intentionally, had booby-trapped the tomb with poison. Other, more exotic theories emerged. What about radiation? The ancient Egyptians were masters of mining. Perhaps to protect the king, they had lined the tomb with naturally radioactive materials like uranium ore. The constant low-level radiation over months and years of exposure could have caused the cancers and illnesses that afflicted the team. This theory, however, has been largely debunked. Geiger counter readings in the tomb show only normal background levels of radiation. The most chilling theory, however, had nothing to do with microbes or minerals. It had to do with the poisoners themselves. Some historians, looking at the political turmoil of the 1920s, suggested a human culprit. Consider the extremist factions of Egyptian nationalists. They were furious at the desecration of a pharaoh's tomb by foreign excavators. Is it possible that some of the victims were not victims of a pharaoh, but of a modern assassin? This theory gained traction with the death of Sir Lee Stack, the Governor General of Sudan, who was assassinated in Cairo in 1924, right in the middle of the Tutankhamun political crisis. It proved that political murder was a reality of the time. But the most powerful and most probable rational explanation for the curse is that there was no curse at all. It was a statistical illusion, a product of coincidence, confirmation bias, and a hysterical press. In 2002, Dr. Mark Nelson of Monash University in Australia conducted a definitive study. He looked at the 44 Westerners who were identified as being present at the opening of the tomb. He then tracked their survival. He found that of the 25 people who were actually present when the tomb, the sarcophagus, or the coffins were opened, the ones who received the highest exposure to the supposed curse, the average age of death was 70. This was not just a normal life expectancy for the early 20th century. It was, in fact, slightly better than average. Howard Carter, the chief desecrator, he lived for 17 more years, dying at age 64. Dr. Douglas Derry, the man who physically cut the mummy apart, he lived another 18 years, dying at age 87. Lady Evelyn Herbert, Carnarvon's daughter, one of the first people inside the antechamber, she lived for another 57 years, dying in 1980 at the age of 78. The curse simply did not hold up to scrutiny. So why did the world believe it? Because of reporting bias. When an old man dies of a fever in Luxor, it is not news. But when an old man who visited King Tut's tomb dies of a fever, it is a front-page story. The press, having been shut out by Carter, created the curse, and then they fed it. They connected deaths that had no connection. A suicide in London, a murder in a hotel, a fever in New York. All were woven into the same brilliant, terrifying tapestry. Lord Carnarvon's death, the event that started it all, was almost certainly a tragic but mundane medical event. A mosquito bite, an infected razor cut, and no penicillin. The curse was a story, the greatest story that archaeology had ever produced. But for one man, the curse was all too real. Not the curse of a pharaoh, but the curse of his own success. The world had debunked the supernatural plague, but it had not yet accounted for the tragic, lonely fate of the one man the magic had supposedly spared. Howard Carter had survived. He had outlived the curse. He had outlived the fevers, the rumors, and the hysteria. He had breathed the ancient air and handled the sacred body of the king, and he had walked away, seemingly unharmed. He had also, finally, completed his work. In 1932, 10 long, grueling years after he had first peered through the hole in the doorway, the last artifact was removed from the tomb and sent to the Cairo Museum. The tomb of Tutankhamun was at last empty. The excavation was over. Carter, now 58 years old, was a man without a purpose. His entire adult life had been a singular, obsessive quest. First, to find the tomb, then to excavate it. That quest was now complete, and he was left in the silence that followed. And it was in this silence that the real curse, the one crafted not by a pharaoh, but by fate, truly began to tighten its grip. Carter was, by any measure, the most famous archaeologist on Earth. He had made the greatest discovery in human history. But he was also a pariah. He returned to England, but he did not return a hero. The British establishment, the academics at the universities, and the curators at the British Museum had never accepted him. He was still the tradesman's son, the uneducated artist's assistant. They resented his fame. They were jealous of his success. And they had not forgotten his abrasive, stubborn, and difficult personality. He was never offered a knighthood, the standard honor for a man of his accomplishments. He was never given a prestigious university post or a museum directorship. He was isolated professionally. The press, which had once hounded him, now largely ignored him. The curse story was old news, and Carter, the living, breathing, perfectly healthy contradiction to that story, was no longer interesting. He was also isolated personally. He had never married. He had no children. His life had been his work. The intense, all-consuming partnership with Lord Carnarvon was gone. His closest colleagues from the dig, like A.C. Mace, were dead. He was a profoundly lonely man. He divided his time between his flat in London and his beloved dusty house in Luxor, near the Valley of the Kings. He pottered about, he wrote, he gave the occasional lecture, but the fire was gone. He became a collector of antiquities, but even that was poisoned. Rumors, which persist to this day, began to circulate that Carter, during the chaos of the excavation, had secretly pocketed some of the smaller, uncatalogued treasures for himself. The man who had given the world its greatest treasure was now, in his old age, being accused of being a common thief. This was his curse. Not a sudden, dramatic death by supernatural means, but a slow, creeping, lonely decay. It was the curse of peaking too soon. He had achieved immortality at the age of 48. The rest of his life was just an epilogue. He had found a tomb filled with a king's magnificent possessions, all designed to ensure a glorious afterlife. But in doing so, he had guaranteed his own life would be a solitary, anticlimactic shadow. The Pharaoh, in a way, had had his revenge. He had not taken Carter's life. He had taken everything but his life. In 1939, as the world was once again preparing for war, Howard Carter fell ill. It was not a mysterious, exotic fever. It was Hodgkin's lymphoma, cancer. He wasted away slowly and painfully in his London flat. On March 2, 1939, Howard Carter died. He was 64 years old. His death was not front-page news. There were no reports of power outages in London, no pets mysteriously dropping dead. His funeral was small. It was quiet. Very few people attended. Lady Evelyn Herbert, Carnarvon's daughter, and one of the last surviving witnesses to the opening of the tomb, was one of them. The man who had discovered Tutankhamun died almost as obscurely as the boy king himself had, before the tomb was found. He was buried in Putney Vale Cemetery in London. His gravestone, simple and easily missed, bears an inscription that serves as a final, poignant epitaph. It is taken from a wishing cup found in Tutankhamun's tomb. It reads, "May your spirit live. May you spend millions of years, you who love Thebes, sitting with your face to the north wind, your eyes beholding happiness." It was a final, quiet link to the discovery that had defined him, given him immortality, and, in the end, destroyed him. The curse of the pharaohs was real, but it was a human curse. It was a curse of media hysteria, of political greed, of professional jealousy, and of the crushing, isolating weight of fame. The tomb is now a tourist site. The treasures are in a museum. But the legend of the curse, that, it seems, is the one thing that will truly remain immortal. The tomb of Tutankhamun was no longer a tomb. It had been converted into a factory for processing, preserving, and shipping the past. But outside, in the sun-baked, frenzied world of 1923, the discovery had given birth to something else, a new global phenomenon. The world did not just read about Tutankhamun, it consumed him. This was the birth of Tutmania, and it was, in its own way, the most potent and visible manifestation of the curse. It was a curse of obsession. The world, starved for glamour after the grim, gray years of the First World War, was suddenly given an injection of pure, decadent gold. The artifacts, revealed in Harry Burton's stark, beautiful photographs, were not just antiquities, they were modern art. The motifs of the tomb exploded into popular culture. In Paris, jewelers like Cartier and Van Cleef and Arpels abandoned the soft curves of Art Nouveau and embraced the bold, geometric, and exotic lines of Egypt. Women wore dresses patterned with lotus flowers and scarab beetles. Their makeup changed. The heavy, kohl-rimmed eyes of the Pharaoh's golden mask became the signature look of the 1920s flapper. In architecture, the dignified European styles gave way to Egyptian revival. Movie palaces in America were built with towering, pylon-shaped facades. Grauman's Egyptian theater opened in Hollywood. Buildings were adorned with sphinxes and winged sun discs. Even the music changed. Songs like Old King Tut and Egyptian Ella became jazz club hits, their melodies mixing American swing with a supposed mysticism of the Nile. Tutankhamun was everywhere. He sold cigarettes, he sold soap, he sold fruit crates. His golden face, a sacred object of resurrection, became a brand. This global mania was fueled almost entirely by the press, and the press was furious. Carter and Carnarvon's exclusive deal with the Times of London had created a wall of silence. The hundreds of other journalists who had flocked to Luxor were left standing in the dust, miles from the tomb, with nothing to report. They were humiliated, and they were vindictive. If they could not get the facts from Carter, they would create their own story. And the story they created was the curse. It was the perfect narrative. It had everything: ancient magic, untold riches, a boy god risen from the grave, and the hubris of modern man. When Lord Carnarvon died, it was not just news, it was vindication. It was the proof. The story was true. The journalists in Luxor, living in the cramped hotels, their professional pride wounded, began to compete. They hunted for any scrap of misfortune, any rumor, and they amplified it, blasting it across the world's telegraph wires. The story of Carter's golden bird, the canary eaten by the cobra, was almost certainly an invention, or at least a wild exaggeration, born in the bars of the Winter Palace Hotel. But it was too good to check. It became a central pillar of the legend. The novelist Marie Corelli, a popular writer of supernatural thrillers, became the curse's high priestess. Her public warning, published just before Carnarvon's death, made her look like a prophet. She fanned the flames, speaking of secret poisons and elemental spirits that guarded the tomb, giving the public the occult language it craved. The curse, in effect, became a collaborative fiction, written by a global network of angry reporters. And they needed more characters. They needed more victims. George J. Gould, the American financier who died of pneumonia after a brief visit, was an easy target. He was wealthy, he was present, he died. To the press, this was a clear case of cause and effect. The fact that he was in his late 50s and died of a common ailment was irrelevant. The Egyptian prince, Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey, was an even more sensational story. Shot by his French wife in a London hotel. This wasn't a curse, it was a crime of passion. But the papers quickly added him to the list. The Pharaoh's magic, they suggested, had driven the woman to murderous rage. The curse narrative was so powerful, it began to rewrite events in real time. Take the case of Arthur Weigel. He was another Egyptologist, a rival of Carter's, and, most importantly, a journalist himself, writing for the Daily Mail. He was part of the press corps that had been shut out. He was openly critical of Carter. He, too, died relatively young in 1934. But his death was from a long-standing, known illness. It did not matter. He had been to the valley. He had defied Carter. He was added to the list. The curse became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Anyone associated with the tomb was now living under a microscope. A car accident, a bout of flu, a personal tragedy, all were immediately seen as the Pharaoh's work. This atmosphere of supernatural terror had a real chilling effect. It began to weigh on the excavation team itself. The local Egyptian workers, who had their own deep-rooted beliefs about the spirits of the dead, grew increasingly uneasy. The Western team members, though men of science, were not immune. They were working in a cramped, dark, underground space, surrounded by the iconography of death, while the entire world outside was screaming that they were doomed. It was an immense psychological burden. A.C. Mace, Carter's vital assistant, was a man of science. He was an expert from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He worked for years, painstakingly preserving the delicate chariots and textiles. But the work was grueling. The chemicals were toxic. The heat was unbearable. He began to suffer from pleurisy, a lung inflammation. His health broke. He had to leave Egypt, and he died in 1928. Was it a curse? Or was it years of inhaling dust and chemical fumes in a poorly ventilated tomb? To the public, the distinction was meaningless. But the most tragic, and perhaps the most famous, victims of the curse were the Bethel family. Richard Bethel was Howard Carter's young personal secretary. He was the man who cataloged the gold. He was there day in and day out, handling the artifacts, breathing the air, and organizing the endless notes. In 1929, 7 years after the opening, Bethel was found dead in his bed in a Mayfair club. He was only 46. The death was suspicious. Some said it was a heart attack. Some said suicide. The papers naturally whispered of suffocation, of a gray, terrifying expression on his face. He was added emphatically to the list. This tragedy, however, unleashed a second one. Bethel's father, Lord Westbury, was plunged into grief. Westbury's home in London contained several artifacts from the tomb that his son had, perhaps illegally, sent home. After his son's death, Lord Westbury, in his 70s, reportedly became obsessed with the artifacts, believing they were the source of his family's misfortune. In 1930, Lord Westbury leapt to his death from his 7th-floor apartment. The press had its masterpiece, a double tragedy. A father and son struck down by the Pharaoh's vengeance. They even added a grotesque footnote. The hearse that was transporting Lord Westbury's body to the cemetery allegedly struck and killed a child who was playing in the street. The curse was now a runaway train. A narrative so powerful it could absorb any tragedy, any death, any accident, and make it part of its own mythology. It was the ultimate fake news story, and it was far more successful and far more memorable than the quiet, difficult, scientific truth. While the world was busy counting ghosts, a new front in the war was opening. The ghosts were a distraction. The real battle was for the truth. Scientists, doctors, and skeptics who had been silent for years began to fight back. They were armed not with magic, but with logic. And they were about to perform their own autopsy, not on a king, but on the curse itself. The public had its spectacle. The press had its perfect story. But the scientific community, which had at first dismissed the curse as tabloid nonsense, began to realize that the legend itself was a pathogen. It was infecting public perception, overshadowing the greatest scientific discovery of the age. It was time for a rational response. The hunt for a logical curse began. The most popular and the most compelling candidate was the tomb toxin theory. The tomb was a sealed box. It was a 3,300-year-old petri dish. Inside, the ingredients for a biological weapon were all present. There was the mummy, a decaying organic body, however well preserved. There were the offerings of food, ducks, geese, cuts of beef, blackened and desiccated, but still organic. There were the plant-based materials, the linen bandages, the papyrus reeds, the wooden furniture. All of this in the dark, still, slightly humid air was a feast for microorganisms. Scientists, particularly epidemiologists, suggested that when Carter and Carnarvon breached that first sealed doorway, they weren't just met with the smell of old perfume. They were met with a concentrated, aerosolized cloud of dormant, deadly spores. The prime suspect was Aspergillus, a genus of common mold. You find it on rotting food or in damp basements. But in a sealed tomb with no competition, it could have flourished, its spores coating every surface. When inhaled, these spores can cause a severe respiratory infection called aspergillosis. It mimics pneumonia. It causes high fever, shortness of breath, and, in a compromised patient, death. Look at the victims. A.C. Mace, the conservationist. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, the radiologist. Both men worked for long periods inside the tomb, breathing that air. Both died of respiratory illnesses. And then there was the crucial victim, Lord Carnarvon. Carnarvon was, by all accounts, a man in frail health. His 1903 car crash had severely damaged his lungs. He was exactly the kind of person who would be uniquely vulnerable to a massive, inhaled fungal load. The mosquito bite, the razor cut. This was the second part of the attack. His body, already fighting a severe lung inflammation from the tomb spores, was now hit with a bacterial infection. The cut allowed streptococcus or staphylococcus, common skin bacteria, to enter his bloodstream. His immune system, already compromised by his damaged lungs and the new fungal assault, simply collapsed. Sepsis set in. His organs failed. This theory was elegant. It was scientific. It replaced a ghost with a microbe. In later years, this theory was tested. Scientists taking samples from the walls of other similar tombs in the valley found viable, living spores of Aspergillus and other potentially pathogenic bacteria. The microbes could survive for millennia. The tomb toxin hypothesis became the standard rational explanation. The curse was real, but it was microbiology. Other more exotic scientific theories were proposed. What about poison? The ancient Egyptians were master chemists. They knew how to create pigments from arsenic and lead. They understood the properties of hemlock and other toxins. Is it possible the priests had deliberately booby-trapped the tomb? Perhaps they coated the floors with a powdered, indiscernible poison. Or, more sinisterly, perhaps the golden treasures themselves were painted with a clear contact poison, designed to be absorbed through the skin. This theory, while dramatic, had problems. Why would the poison remain potent for 3,300 years? And why would it affect some people and not others? A darker, more modern variation of this theory emerged. What if the poison wasn't ancient? What if it was modern? Consider the political situation. Egypt was in turmoil, fighting for its independence from Britain. Carter was seen as an arrogant colonial grave robber. The tomb was a nationalistic flashpoint. Is it possible that certain extremist nationalist factions, angered by the desecration, decided to take matters into their own hands? Could they have poisoned Lord Carnarvon, a symbol of the British aristocracy, to make it look like a pharaoh's curse, to scare the other excavators away? A mosquito bite, an infected razor cut. It could have been a tragic accident, or it could have been the perfect cover for an assassin who slipped a potent, fast-acting bacterial culture onto Carnarvon's razor. This theory, while unprovable, added a layer of human malice that was, for some, even more chilling than a ghost. But in the end, the most powerful, the most logical, and the most probable explanation for the Curse of King Tut was that there was no curse at all. There was no toxin. There was no poison. There was no magic. There was only statistics and coincidence. In 2002, Mark Nelson, an epidemiologist at Monash University in Australia, decided to end the speculation. He conducted the first and only true scientific study of the curse. He did not look for mold. He looked at data. He identified 44 individuals who could be classified as Westerners who were in Egypt and exposed to the tomb during the key discovery phase. He then divided them into two groups. Group 1, the cursed. This group had 25 people. These were the ones who were actually present at the major desecration events: the opening of the tomb, the opening of the burial chamber, and the opening of the coffins. These were the people who received the full, supposed blast of the Pharaoh's magic or his microbes. Group 2. This was the uncursed. These were people who were in Egypt at the same time, but who were not present at the openings. He then tracked the survival rates for both groups. The results, when they were published, were the final nail in the curse's coffin. There was no statistically significant difference between the two groups. The cursed group did not die any younger than the uncursed group. In fact, the 25 people in the cursed group lived on average for another 20.8 years after the exposure. Their average age at death was 70. This was a perfectly normal, even slightly good life expectancy for people born in the late 19th century. Let's look at the survivors, the people the curse narrative conveniently forgets. Howard Carter, the chief intruder, the man who stuck his head in the tomb first. He breathed the air, he touched the mask, he dissected the king. He lived for another 17 years, dying of lymphoma at age 64. Lady Evelyn Herbert, Lord Carnarvon's daughter. She was in the antechamber on the first day, standing right behind Carter. She lived for another 57 years, dying in 1980 at the age of 78. Dr. Douglas Derry, the anatomist, the man who literally sawed King Tutankhamun's body into pieces. He must have been the most cursed man on earth. He lived for another 46 years, dying in 1969 at the age of 87. Harry Burton, the photographer. He spent thousands of hours in the tomb, working with toxic chemicals and bright lights. He lived for another 17 years. The curse was a myth. It was a classic case of what we now call confirmation bias. The world was looking for deaths. So when a death occurred, Lord Carnarvon, George J. Gould, it was seized upon as proof. When someone didn't die, like Carter or Lady Evelyn or Dr. Derry, that fact was simply ignored. It didn't fit the story. The deaths themselves were easily explained. Carnarvon, a mundane, if tragic, infection in a pre-antibiotic world. Gould, pneumonia. Bethel, suicide or heart attack. Lord Westbury, suicide from brief. These were the normal human tragedies of any group of 44 people stretched out over a decade. The curse was not a pharaoh's magic. It was a media creation, a story so good, so powerful, that it refused to die. But the debunking of the supernatural curse only served to highlight the reality of the other curse, the human one. The world was now convinced that the pharaoh's magic was a fantasy. But for Howard Carter, the man who had survived, the curse of his own discovery was just beginning. He had escaped the tomb. He would not escape its legacy. Howard Carter was the man who solved the mystery. He had given the world to Tutankhamun, and in return, the world, it seemed, was determined to make him pay for it. His curse was not of the tomb. It was of the living. It was a curse of politics, jealousy, and profound, crushing loneliness. The first front in this war was political. It began the moment Carter and Carnarvon signed their exclusive deal with the Times. That single act, designed to control the excavation, instead united the entire rest of the world against them. The Egyptian government, pulsing with a new nationalist fervor, was enraged. This was their pharaoh. This was their heritage. How dare these British colonialists lock them out and sell their story to a London newspaper? Carter, a man with the social skills of a badger, made things worse. He was stubborn. He was arrogant. He treated the Egyptian officials with undisguised contempt. He saw the tomb as his property by right of discovery. The Egyptian Antiquities Service, led by the formidable Frenchman Pierre Lecoq, saw things very differently. Lecoq was determined that not one single object from the tomb would leave Egypt. The relationship between the two men disintegrated into open warfare. Carter would block officials from visiting the tomb. The government would retaliate by cutting off his electricity, plunging his delicate conservation work into chaos. The situation became a global scandal. The press, already hostile, painted Carter as a greedy imperialist. The final explosion came in 1924. The Egyptian government, angered by Carter's refusal to allow their wives a private tour, showed up at the tomb with police. They demanded entry. Carter, in a fit of pure self-destructive rage, refused. He shouted at the officials. Then, in the ultimate act of defiance, he gathered his team, locked the heavy iron gate to the tomb, and abandoned the excavation entirely. He put a notice on the tomb door, written in his own hand, stating that all work was suspended. He had, in effect, gone on strike. The Egyptian government's response was swift and brutal. They seized the tomb. They canceled Carnarvon's concession. They officially fired Howard Carter. They changed the locks. For an entire agonizing year, Carter was locked out of his own discovery. The greatest find in history lay in limbo, a hostage in a political war. This was the curse. To be able to see the promised land, but to be forbidden from entering. Carter fled to America, embarking on a bitter lecture tour, railing against the Egyptian government. He was a man adrift, his life's work stolen from him. Eventually, a new, more moderate government came to power in Egypt, and a compromise was brokered. But it was a total defeat for Carter. He was allowed to return, but not as the conqueror. He returned as a mere employee of the Antiquities Service. He had to formally renounce all claims to the treasures. He had to accept government oversight of every move he made. He agreed. He had no choice. He had to finish. He returned to the valley in 1925, but the joy was gone. The work continued, but it was now a joyless, bitter duty. He was surrounded by inspectors, his every decision questioned. The second front of his curse was professional. When the excavation finally ended in 1932, Carter returned to England. He should have been received as a national hero. He was the most famous archaeologist on Earth. Instead, he was met with a cold shoulder. The British academic establishment, the universities, the British Museum, had always looked down on him. He was not one of them. He was the uneducated son of an artist. He didn't have a degree. He had gotten his hands dirty. They were jealous. They resented his fame. They resented his abrasive personality. He was never offered a knighthood. He was never given an honorary doctorate. He was never offered a prestigious post. He was, once again, locked out. He was a man who had made history, but who was denied a place within it. The third, and perhaps most painful front of his curse was personal, and this one would outlive him. It was the accusation of theft. For decades, rumors had whispered that Carter, the meticulous scientist, had a secret. That he had used the chaos of the excavation, the thousands of minor objects, to pocket a few souvenirs for himself. In the 1990s, decades after his death, the proof seemed to emerge. An Egyptologist, Barry Kemp, was going through old boxes of Carter's belongings that had been donated to the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. Inside one, he found a small, exquisite golden amulet. It was a Wam amulet, a symbol of the god Amun. It was, without question, from the tomb of Tutankhamun. It matched others from the collection. It had never been catalogued. It had never been sent to Cairo. Carter, the man who had fought so bitterly for the integrity of the excavation, was a thief. The discovery sent a shockwave through the Egyptology world. His reputation was shattered. But, as with all things related to this story, the truth was more complex. Further research revealed a note, also in Carter's files, from Sir Alan Gardiner, a philologist on the team. Carter had given Gardiner the amulet, believing it was not from the tomb, to have it analyzed. Gardiner, after showing it to another expert, wrote back to Carter in alarm, "The amulet you showed me is, I am told, unquestionably from the tomb. I deeply regret having been placed in so awkward a position." Carter, it seems, had been found out. He'd been caught trying to pass off a stolen item. Or had he? The other side of the story is that Carter, finding the amulet in the rubble of the corridor, the area looted by the ancient robbers, genuinely believed it was a stray, not part of the official sealed deposit. He gave it to Gardiner for an honest opinion, and when he was told it was from the tomb, he was too embarrassed and too frightened of the political implications to return it. We will never know the truth, but the accusation hangs over his legacy. Howard Carter spent the last years of his life in profound loneliness. He never married. He had no family. His great work was over. His reputation was tarnished. His health was failing. He died of lymphoma in 1939. He was 64. His funeral was small, attended by only a handful of people. Lady Evelyn Herbert was one of the few who came to pay her respects. The man who had given the world its greatest treasure died almost forgotten. The curse had not claimed his life with a cobra or a fever. It had claimed his legacy. It had claimed his happiness, and it had claimed his good name. The Pharaoh, it seemed, had won. The king's treasures were safe in a museum, and the man who had disturbed his sleep was dead, alone, and in disgrace. But the story was not over. The king himself, the center of this entire storm, still had secrets to tell, and a new generation of science would give him a voice. The excavation was over. The curse had been debunked. The discoverer was dead. The story, it seemed, was finished. All that was left was the treasure, a silent golden mountain in the Cairo Museum. But in the late 20th and early 21st century, a new chapter began. Science, which had been used to debunk the curse, was now turned on the king. For the first time, we had the technology to ask the mummy questions that Dr. Douglas Derry, with his hot knives, could not. Who was Tutankhamun? How did he live? And most importantly, how did he die? The first great mystery to solve was his death. For decades, the prevailing theory was murder. In 1968, a team from the University of Liverpool X-rayed the mummy. They made a shocking discovery. There was a bone fragment floating inside the king's skull. There was also a shadow at the base of his skull, suggesting a heavy blow. The story wrote itself. The boy king, just 19, was assassinated. A blow to the back of the head. The prime suspects, his powerful vizier, Ai, who married his widow and became pharaoh right after him. Or his ambitious general, Horemheb, who became pharaoh after Ai. Tutankhamun was no longer just a symbol of treasure. He was a victim, a tragic, murdered boy. This theory held for decades. It was the truth of King Tut. Then, in 2005, a new team, led by Dr. Zahi Hawass, brought in a far more powerful tool, a portable CT scanner. They performed a full 3D, high-resolution scan of the entire mummy, over 1,700 images. The results were revolutionary. They overturned everything. First, the murder theory. The CT scan showed definitively that there was no blow to the head. The shadow was an artifact of the 1968 X-ray. The bone fragment inside the skull? It wasn't from a blow. It was a fragment of the vertebrae that had been dislodged and pushed into the skull by Carter's and Derry's own team during the brutal unwrapping. The king had not been murdered, at least not that way. But the scan did reveal a new, terrible injury, a severe compound fracture to his left leg, just above the knee. The break was fresh. There were no signs of healing. This was a major, life-threatening injury. A new story emerged. The king, who was often shown riding chariots, was a reckless youth. He had suffered a terrible chariot crash, shattering his leg. The wound became infected. Sepsis set in, and he died within days. This too was a compelling story, but the science was not done. In 2010, the team went deeper. They extracted DNA from the mummy. This was the first time a pharaoh's genetic code had ever been read. The DNA told an even more complex and tragic story. First, his family tree. The DNA proved that his father was the heretic king Akhenaten, and his mother? She was one of Akhenaten's sisters, a mummy known as the Younger Lady. Tutankhamun was the product of incest. This was common for Egyptian royalty, who believed they were gods, but it had devastating medical consequences. The DNA, combined with the CT scans, painted a new portrait of the king. He was not a dashing chariot-riding warrior. The scans showed he had a severe cleft palate. He had a club foot. His left foot was badly deformed, turned inward. He would have been unable to walk without a cane. And suddenly, another part of the treasure made sense. The tomb contained over 130 walking sticks, many of them showing clear signs of use. These were not ceremonial. They were his mobility aids. The DNA told one more story. Inside his body, they found the DNA of Plasmodium falciparum, the deadliest strain of malaria. A new and final theory of his death emerged. Tutankhamun was not a mighty king. He was a frail, sickly boy. He was genetically compromised. He had a deformed foot and had to walk with a cane. He was suffering from a debilitating chronic case of malaria. Then he suffered an accident. Perhaps he just fell, easy to do with a clubfoot. He broke his leg. For a healthy person, this was survivable. But for a boy whose immune system was already ravaged by chronic malaria and genetic disorders, a severe break was a death sentence. The infection, the fever, the malaria, his body just gave up. He was not murdered. He was not a reckless warrior. He was a tragic, disabled boy king who died of a combination of bad genes, bad luck, and disease. Science had finally given us the real Tutankhamun. He was, in a way, far more human and far more tragic than the golden god on his coffin. But the science also gave us something else. It gave us a new appreciation for his life. His father, Akhenaten, had tried to destroy Egypt's entire religion, replacing the hundreds of gods with one, the Aten, or the sun disk. The artifacts in Tutankhamun's tomb show the end of that revolution. They show the return to the old gods, Amun, Osiris, Anubis. Tutankhamun's 9-year reign, short as it was not insignificant. It was the period when Egypt healed itself. It was the Restoration. His name, Tutankhamun, literally means the living image of Amun. His very existence was a political statement. The treasures were not just gold. They were the physical evidence of a kingdom pulling itself back from the brink of civil war. The tomb was not a time capsule of a random pharaoh. It was a time capsule of the most important, pivotal, and dramatic era in Egyptian history, the Amarna period. The discovery had changed everything. It created the blockbuster museum exhibition. The Treasures of Tutankhamun tour in the 1970s was the first of its kind, drawing millions of people and creating a new model for museums. It cemented ancient Egypt as the most fascinating culture in human history. And it gave Egypt, the modern nation, a new, powerful symbol of its identity. The treasure, which Carter had fought so hard to catalog, is now the centerpiece of the new multi-billion-dollar Grand Egyptian Museum in Giza. The king, however, is not with his treasure. By order of the government, he was returned to his tomb. He lies there today in the Valley of the Kings, in his original quartzite sarcophagus. His damaged, unwrapped mummy rests in a climate-controlled glass box just a few feet from the golden coffin lid. He is, once again, alone in the darkness. He has been scanned, X-rayed, and DNA tested. His treasures have been seen by hundreds of millions. His curse has become a global legend. But after all this, after the discovery, the mania, the science, and the myth, one great question remains. Why? Why this story? Why does this tomb, out of all the tombs, and this king, out of all the pharaohs, hold such an iron grip on our imagination? We have reached the end of our 15-part journey. We have followed the clues. We have dug the sand. We have opened the sealed doors. We have seen the wonderful things. We have watched a global mania unfold. We have debunked a supernatural curse. We have analyzed the human curse that destroyed its discoverer. And we have used modern science to finally, truly meet the king. And now we are left with the echo of the story. Why does it endure? The answer, perhaps, is that the curse of King Tut is not really about a curse, or even about a king. It is about us. It is a perfect mirror, reflecting our own deeply human relationship with death, with the past, and with the sacred. We want to believe in the curse, because on some level, we believe the tomb should be cursed. We understand instinctively that what Carter did was a violation. It was a desecration. It was, for all its scientific value, a form of grave robbing. The curse is our way of processing that collective guilt. It is a story we tell ourselves to restore a moral balance. It says, you cannot steal from the dead and get away with it. It is a story about hubris, the hubris of modern man who believes that with his science and his machines he can conquer the past, that he can literally dissect a god. The curse is the past fighting back. It is also a story about fame. We are left with two legacies, that of the king and that of his discoverer. Tutankhamun, a minor, frail boy, has achieved an immortality greater than any other human being. His name is known by billions. His face is more recognizable than that of most living celebrities. He won. He is eternal. Howard Carter, the brilliant, obsessive, difficult man, also achieved immortality. But his is a tragic one. He is the man who found the king, but at the cost of his happiness, his reputation, and his peace. One man is famous for his death. The other is famous despite his death. The story endures because it is the greatest mystery story ever told, and it is a true story. It has the perfect setting, a lost valley, a hidden staircase. It has the perfect hero, a stubborn, obsessive underdog, Howard Carter. It has the perfect treasure, a hoard of unimaginable glittering gold. And it has the perfect monster, a vengeful, invisible, and all-powerful phantom. But perhaps the most profound reason this story stays with us is that it is a memento mori, a reminder of death. When we look at the golden mask of Tutankhamun, we are not just looking at history. We are looking at an object that was designed to defeat time, to conquer oblivion. The mask is a statement of defiance. It says, I was here, I mattered, and you will not forget me. And for 3,300 years, that mask and the king it protected failed. He was forgotten. His tomb was buried. His name was erased from the king lists by his successors. He was, for 3 millennia, a complete and total failure. And then, in one brilliant, improbable moment, he was found. The story of King Tut is not a story of a curse. It is a story of resurrection. It is the story of a second chance at immortality. It reminds us that history is not just a collection of facts. It is a shifting, living thing. It can be buried, it can be lost, and it can, against all odds, be found. The tomb is now quiet. The king rests in his valley. His treasures are safe, waiting for millions more to gaze upon them. But the legend, the 1,000-year mystery of the boy king and the curse he supposedly unleashed, is now free. It has left the tomb. It has outlived its victims and its creators. And it will, most likely, outlive us all. Thank you for joining us on this journey. This has been 1,000-Year Mystery.